Imagine a single artillery shell weighing nearly 2 tons. In 1942, Germany unleashed approximately 200 of these gargantuan projectiles against the defenses of Sevastopol. They left behind massive craters, obliterated ordinary buildings, and were fully expected to crush heavy concrete fortresses into dust. Yet, despite this apocalyptic bombardment, 4 Soviet 305mm guns inside the targeted fortress simply kept firing. They remained completely operational and deadly, holding the line until German infantry finally managed to reach their very doorstep. How could a bombardment designed to vaporize everything in its path fail to silence its ultimate target? The answer lies in a violent collision between a supposed engineering marvel and the brutal, uncompromising reality of war. In the early summer of 1942, the German High Command treated the Siege of Sevastopol as the ultimate proving ground for a military philosophy that equated sheer, overwhelming size with a guarantee of absolute victory. This is the story of how that philosophy broke down. It explores an engagement where the sheer kinetic force of an incoming projectile seemed completely unstoppable on paper, but violently fell short in practice. It reveals what happens when a military apparatus attempts to solve a complex tactical puzzle simply by swinging an unimaginably heavier hammer. On the pristine blueprints in Berlin, and at the heavily monitored testing grounds, the mathematical calculations of these strikes left no room for doubt. The resulting devastation was meant to be total, erasing heavily fortified positions and leaving nothing but shattered concrete and deafening silence in its wake. Yet, the reality on the scorched earth of the Crimean Peninsula dictated otherwise. The events of that summer demonstrate exactly how a weapon possessing unprecedented, earth-shattering power ultimately proved insufficient at the very moment it was needed most. How does an army invest staggering amounts of time, resources, and engineering capital into a singular offensive system, only to watch its primary target continue to return fire through the dust and smoke? The failure was not born from a lack of explosive yield, but from the harsh friction between theoretical destruction and practical combat capability. But to fully comprehend why this mechanical behemoth failed to achieve its ultimate objective, and why the siege required much more than just a heavy weapon, you first have to understand the terrifying premise of its design. To recognize where it fell short, you must first look at the machine through the eyes of those who dragged it to the front lines, and understand exactly why every single observer in 1942 believed it was absolutely destined to succeed. To truly comprehend the absolute certainty radiating from the German command in the spring of 1942, you have to stand in the shadow of the machine they brought to the edge of Sevastopol. When the officers of the German 11th Army surveyed the formidable ring of Soviet defenses protecting the critical Black Sea port, they knew standard field artillery would merely scratch the surface of the subterranean bunkers and heavily armored gun emplacements. They needed a skeleton key to unlock the most heavily fortified city in the world. What arrived from the secretive manufacturing floors of the Rheinmetall Borsig Arms Company was not just a piece of artillery, it was a rolling earthquake, an apex predator of siege warfare, officially designated as the Karl-Gerät self-propelled mortar. Looking at this mechanical leviathan, the very concept of resistance seemed fundamentally absurd. This was a 137-ton steel beast. To put that staggering figure into perspective, it weighed as much as 5 standard medium tanks of the era, all consolidated into a single lumbering chassis. It moved on massive, continuous tracks, grinding the earth beneath it into a fine powder just by shifting its position. At the heart of this moving fortress was its primary armament, a colossal 600mm barrel. The bore of the weapon was nearly 2 feet across. It was an opening so cavernous that a fully grown man could easily crawl inside it. When German engineers conceptualized this machine in the late 1930s, they weren't designing a weapon for mobile, fluid warfare. They were designing a bespoke instrument of absolute demolition, engineered specifically to crack the impregnable French Maginot Line. When France fell before the weapon was fully required, it was rerouted to the Eastern Front, hungry for a target worthy of its apocalyptic specifications. But the sheer awe of the Karl-Gerät was not just in the hardened metal of the machine itself. The true testament to its perceived invincibility and the core conflict of its existence lay in the massive logistical ecosystem required simply to keep it alive on the battlefield. A weapon of this unprecedented, monstrous scale could not merely be driven to the front lines like a standard tank. Its deployment was a sprawling, highly coordinated military operation of its own. To transport the mortar across the continent, it had to be partially disassembled and suspended between two custom-built, heavy-duty railway transport cars, forming a specialized train that stretched down the tracks like an armored convoy. It required specially reinforced rail bridges and precise route planning just to reach the theater of war. Once it reached the railhead in the Crimea, the reassembly process demanded exacting precision and heavy lifting equipment before it could even begin its slow crawl toward the combat zone. Even finding a place to park the machine was a monumental feat of engineering. A 137-ton weapon cannot simply pull up to a dirt ridge and open fire. The recoil generated by launching its massive payload was so violent that firing from uneven or soft ground would have permanently buried the suspension or ripped the tracks apart. Before the Karl-Gerät could even aim at the Soviet fortresses, combat engineers had to spend days surveying the landscape, leveling the ground, and preparing a perfectly stable, reinforced firing platform. The machine would then lower its entire chassis directly onto the ground, bypassing its own suspension to transfer the earth-shattering recoil directly into the bedrock of the Crimean Peninsula. Operating the mortar on this meticulously prepared ground was far beyond the capability of a standard artillery squad. It demanded a highly specialized crew of 21 men. These were not mere infantrymen. They were highly trained mechanics, hydraulic specialists, and master artillerists, all working in synchronized unison to manage what was essentially a localized industrial plant. The commander of the gun didn't just calculate coordinates. He orchestrated a highly complex mechanical ballet. Every movement of the weapon, every minor adjustment of the massive barrel, strained its custom internal machinery to the absolute limit. The crew had to constantly monitor hydraulic pressures, oil temperatures, and the sheer mechanical stress being applied to the steel components. The most terrifying aspect of the Karl-Gerät, however, was the staggering cost and effort of its own destructive power. The sheer kinetic force it was designed to deliver required an entirely separate fleet of support vehicles just to feed it. You could not simply pass ammunition up to the breech by hand. The projectiles were too massive, too dense, and too deadly to be handled by human muscle. To solve this, the German army had to permanently convert existing Panzer IV tank chassis into dedicated ammunition carriers, known as Munitionsschlepper. These tracked vehicles followed the Karl-Gerät like remoras accompanying a great white shark, each one carrying only 4 of the gargantuan shells, carefully cradled in specially designed, heavily armored compartments. When it was time to fire, the sequence was a breathtaking display of heavy industry operating in an active combat zone. The ammunition carrier would carefully maneuver directly behind the mortar, aligning perfectly with the rear of the weapon. Then, a dedicated, heavy-duty crane, integrated directly into the support vehicles, swung into action. Thick steel cables groaned under the immense weight as they hoisted a single, concrete-piercing shell from the carrier. This projectile was a monster of ballistics, weighing in at nearly 2 tons, essentially the weight of an entire modern automobile, concentrated into an aerodynamic cylinder of hardened steel and high explosives. The specialized crane slowly, meticulously, lowered the 2-ton shell onto the loading tray. The crew would then use specialized, engine-driven mechanical rammers to forcefully shove the massive projectile into the open breech of the 600-millimeter barrel. This was not rapid-fire field artillery that could fill the air with a constant barrage of shrapnel. The loading process was a grueling, agonizingly deliberate operation that required peak physical exertion, strict safety protocols, and extreme mechanical precision. Even operating at maximum efficiency, under ideal conditions without the distraction of incoming enemy fire, the elite crew could only manage to load and fire about 1 shell every 10 minutes. Every single shot was a monumental event. Every single round loaded into the chamber represented an exorbitant expenditure of fuel, specialized manpower, and custom-manufactured ammunition. Because of this immense logistical burden, the expectations placed upon the Karl-Gerät by the German High Command were impossibly high. For the generals observing the siege, the math was simple, brutal, and supposedly infallible. The 2-ton concrete-piercing shells were engineered with a delayed action fuse and a hardened, incredibly dense steel cap. They were specifically designed not to explode on surface contact. The physics of the strike were calculated to allow the sheer kinetic energy of the heavy mass, plummeting from the sky on a high ballistic arc, to drive the shell deep into the earth or punch directly through solid layers of reinforced concrete. Only after it had violently buried itself into the very heart of a bunker would the massive internal payload of high explosives detonate. The resulting underground shockwave was supposed to cause catastrophic internal overpressure, instantly vaporizing the defenders and collapsing the heaviest fortifications into a crater of pulverized rubble and twisted rebar. Standing at the distant observation posts, watching the 21-man crew finalize the laborious loading sequence, German officers felt a sense of absolute, undeniable certainty. They watched through high-powered binoculars as the heavy barrel elevated toward the sky, a massive steel finger pointing toward the Soviet lines. They felt the air pressure abruptly drop as the weapon fired, unleashing a concussive blast so violently powerful it shook the dirt from the trench walls, rattled teeth inside skulls, and sent a deafening shockwave rolling across the rugged landscape. They tracked the 2-ton shell as it tore through the sky, a dark, screaming speck carrying the destructive yield of a heavy aerial bomber, precision-guided directly toward the thickest Soviet concrete. Looking at the staggering resources poured into this single weapon system, the specialized trains, the converted tank carriers, the heavy cranes, the elite engineering crew, and the earth-shattering roar of the gun itself, it felt like victory was mathematically guaranteed. The sheer scale of the operation convinced every general and artillery officer present that nothing constructed by human hands could possibly withstand a direct hit from such an apocalyptic device. The weapon was simply too big, the shell too heavy, the explosive force too absolute. Any observer standing on those ridges in the early summer of 1942 would naturally expect the targeted Soviet fortress to be instantly pulverized into dust. But the illusion of invincible firepower, built upon pristine blueprints and unchallenged test fires, was about to fracture under its own immense weight. The moment the Karl-Gerät rolled off its custom rail cars and its tracks finally bit into the Crimean dirt, the brutal friction of active warfare began to tear at its pristine theoretical design. The weapon's greatest strength, its unprecedented, earth-shattering size, instantly became its most severe tactical vulnerability. German commanders quickly discovered that operating a mechanical leviathan on an active front line turned every minor logistical hurdle into a grueling crisis. The same 2-ton shells that promised absolute destruction demanded an exhausting, highly fragile supply chain. The dedicated ammunition carriers could only haul 4 rounds at a time. This meant that sustaining a bombardment required a constant, uninterrupted convoy of specialized heavy vehicles crawling back and forth across a peninsula that was already choked with debris, artillery craters, and the chaotic traffic of a massive siege. If a single carrier broke down, or a vital supply road was temporarily blocked by a destroyed truck, the apex predator of the German artillery was instantly reduced to a 137-ton paperweight. And then there was the agonizing reality of the terrain itself. The rugged, sun-baked landscape outside Sevastopol was unforgiving. Moving the heavy mortar into a firing position was not a standard tactical maneuver. It was a slow-motion, geographical struggle. The machine possessed painfully low mobility. Its top speed was barely 3 miles per hour on flat, perfectly stable ground. On the uneven, rutted earth of the Crimea, it moved at an agonizing crawl. Deep ravines, soft soil, and steep inclines were virtually insurmountable obstacles. The massive engine roared, burning through staggering quantities of scarce aviation-grade fuel just to shift the heavy chassis a few hundred yards. Commanders could not quickly redeploy the weapon to exploit a sudden breakthrough or to avoid an incoming threat. Once the Karl-Gerät was committed to a specific path, it was locked into a desperately slow, highly predictable advance. But the most terrifying flaw of this superweapon was dictated by the simple, inescapable laws of ballistics. To launch a projectile weighing nearly 2 tons, a devastating trade-off had been made regarding the weapon's reach. The maximum effective range of the Karl-Gerät, when utilizing its heaviest concrete-piercing shells, was startlingly short. Furthermore, the cavernous barrel possessed minimal horizontal traverse. It could only pivot a few degrees to the left or right. To aim at a target outside this incredibly narrow window, the entire 137-ton vehicle had to be lifted off the ground, rotated on its tracks, and meticulously set back down onto a newly prepared, perfectly leveled firing platform. This severe limitation in range and flexibility created a nightmare scenario for the 21-man crew. To deliver that apocalyptic strike against the deep Soviet fortresses, the German army had to drag this lumbering, highly valuable machine dangerously close to the front lines. They had to park what was essentially a small industrial factory well within the lethal radius of standard Soviet field artillery. It was an agonizing paradox. The weapon designed to destroy the most heavily defended positions in the world had to expose itself directly to the very guns defending them. Because of this extreme proximity, survival required elaborate, exhausting camouflage. Every time the weapon moved into a firing pit, combat engineers had to desperately drape it in massive nets, cut down surrounding foliage to break up its colossal silhouette, and constantly erase the deep track marks left in the dirt, praying that Soviet reconnaissance planes did not spot the fresh scars on the landscape. But this desperate concealment vanished the exact moment the firing sequence began. The concussive blast of a 600mm gun could not be hidden. It threw a towering cloud of dust, smoke, and burning debris high into the air, instantly painting a massive target on the crew's position. The mortar was completely unarmored against direct heavy fire, leaving the specialized crew operating out in the open fully exposed. Every time they pulled the firing lanyard, they knew they were sending a brilliant beacon to every Soviet artillery spotter in the sector. They had to fire and then endure the grueling 10-minute reload process under the constant, terrifying threat of imminent counter-battery fire, hoping they could dismantle their setup and crawl away before high-explosive retaliation rained down from the besieged city. The entire deployment was a high-stakes gamble. The German command was actively trading extreme tactical vulnerability, agonizingly slow mobility, and a fragile logistical tether, all for the promise of one perfect, fortress-crushing strike. For the officers observing the grueling preparation in the summer heat, all these logistical nightmares and all the terrifying exposure to enemy fire would have been entirely worth it if the weapon could actually achieve its sole purpose. They accepted the staggering costs because they believed the target would simply cease to exist. The problem was, The mathematics of absolute victory had already been compromised. The conflict was already lost before the very first trigger was pulled. The target dominating the northern sector of the Sevastopol defense perimeter was not merely a conventional gun emplacement lightly dug into the hills. It was a sprawling subterranean fortress, an armored island anchored deeply and permanently into the unforgiving rocky ridges of the Belbek River Valley. Officially designated in Soviet records as Coastal Battery No. 30 and known to the increasingly frustrated German command by the ominous operational moniker Maxim Gorky I, this installation served as the absolute linchpin of the entire Soviet defensive line. To truly understand the monumental miscalculation made by the German High Command in the early summer of 1942, one must first look far beneath the scorched surface of the earth, down into the darkness, where the true, uncompromising strength of Battery No. 30 was purposefully hidden. The visible portion of the fortress was intimidating enough on its own to give any advancing army pause. Protruding from the blasted landscape were two massive, heavily armored naval turrets, each housing twin 305mm rifled guns. These were colossal, dreadnought-class weapons, originally forged for the decks of heavy battleships, capable of hurling half-ton explosive shells over 25 miles out to sea or deep into the hinterlands. But these heavy turrets, sweeping the horizon with their massive barrels, were just the tip of a highly sophisticated, deeply buried concrete iceberg. Beneath the heavy guns lay a self-contained subterranean city, meticulously designed to sustain a garrison of over 300 men through the most grueling, prolonged siege imaginable. The underground complex stretched out in a sprawling labyrinth of reinforced corridors. There were cavernous ammunition magazines stacked with volatile powder bags and heavy shells, dedicated power generation rooms equipped with massive, thrumming diesel engines to keep the fortress alive, sophisticated ventilation systems designed to filter out chemical gas and smoke, intricate plotting rooms filled with ballistic computers, and a fully equipped medical facility. All of this vital, breathing infrastructure was encased within a monolithic shell of reinforced concrete that represented the absolute pinnacle of Soviet military engineering in the 1930s. And it was exactly here, locked within the cold mathematical reality of this poured concrete shell, that the fatal flaw of the German offensive plan was silently, stubbornly waiting. When the elite engineers back at the Rheinmetall-Borsig arms manufacturing plants in Germany had originally designed the Karl-Gerät's massive 2-ton concrete-piercing projectiles, they had not worked in a vacuum. They relied heavily on vast amounts of structural data gathered from the most formidable fortifications known to Western Europe. They had painstakingly calculated the sheer kinetic energy required to successfully punch through the heavy bunkers of the French Maginot Line or the thick border forts of Czechoslovakia. Based on these exhaustive, highly controlled, pristine test firings, the specialized delayed fuse baton grenade shell was mathematically certified to penetrate slightly over 8 feet of solid, steel-reinforced concrete before finally detonating its catastrophic internal payload. On the pristine blueprints in Berlin, and within the minds of the artillery generals, 8 feet of penetration was considered an insurmountable, absolute margin of overkill. In the established theater of European warfare, no one built defensive roofs thicker than 8 feet. It was considered structurally unnecessary and logistically impossible. But the Soviet engineers, who had meticulously planned and constructed Battery No. 30, had not built their fortress to Western European standards. Anticipating the sheer, devastating destructive capability of heavy, sustained naval bombardment from the Black Sea Fleet, they had poured their concrete with an almost paranoid, obsessive level of redundancy. The construction had been a monumental undertaking, requiring continuous day and night pouring of highly specialized naval-grade cement to avoid any structural weaknesses or cold joints from forming between the layers. The main protective deck, the critical shield overlying the highly volatile ammunition magazines, and the central command bunker of the battery, was not 8 feet thick. It was shielded by approximately 13 feet of continuous, heavily reinforced solid concrete, poured tightly over a dense interwoven matrix of thick steel girders and heavy rebar. The discrepancy between the weapon and the target was absolute. It was not a matter of tactical skill or crew training or battlefield bravery. It was a matter of pure, uncompromising physics. The German command had hauled a 137-ton mechanical superweapon across an entire continent to shatter a fortress, utterly unaware that the mathematics of their own specialized ammunition rendered the task functionally impossible. The bespoke siege weapon was perfectly designed to crack an 8-foot vault. The vault they were facing was 13 feet deep. The conflict was entirely doomed to fail before the very first heavy shell was ever hoisted onto the loading tray. Ignorant of this deeply buried subterranean reality, the German artillery crews operating in the rugged terrain outside Sevastopol finalized their complex firing solutions. The massive, cavernous barrel of the Karl-Gerät was slowly, mechanically elevated by the winding hydraulic systems, locking firmly into its extreme, high-angle ballistic trajectory. The firing command was shouted over the roar of the idling support vehicles. The subsequent sequence of events was a breathtaking, terrifying display of raw mechanical violence. When the firing lanyard was pulled, the 600mm gun did not merely fire, it erupted with the force of a localized natural disaster. The sheer, instantaneous concussive force of the massive propellant charge aggressively displaced the air surrounding the weapon, creating a violent, localized vacuum that kicked up a radial, blinding storm of dust, rocks, and debris. The massive, heavily armored steel chassis of the machine violently compressed downward against its own restraints, transferring the catastrophic, earth-shattering recoil directly into the specially prepared, leveled earthen platform, sending a deep, seismic shudder rolling directly through the bedrock of the Crimean Peninsula. Out of this blinding, deafening flash of rapidly expanding gases, the 2-ton projectile was hurled violently into the sky. It did not whistle like a standard high-velocity artillery shell. Because of its immense mass, its sheer density, and its blunt aerodynamic profile, it tore through the atmosphere with a deep, guttural, terrifying roar, sounding much more like a derailed, plummeting freight train than a conventional weapon of war. It quickly reached the apex of its high ballistic arc, hanging in the sky for a fraction of a second, and then began its steep, accelerating, terrifying descent, drawn by gravity directly toward the reinforced concrete of battery number 30. When the first of these heavy shells struck the earth immediately surrounding the Soviet fortress, the resulting devastation seemed to completely validate every boast made by the German engineering corps. The impacts were truly apocalyptic. A single round, burying its hardened steel nosecap deep into the rocky Crimean soil, before the meticulously timed delayed fuse finally initiated the massive internal payload of high explosives, instantly displaced thousands of tons of packed earth and solid limestone. The catastrophic detonations ripped gaping craters into the landscape so massive and deep that entire multi-story buildings could easily be swallowed whole within their sloping, pulverized walls. The invisible shockwaves radiating violently outward from these subterranean blasts snapped mature trees like brittle twigs, completely pulverized any surrounding standard masonry, and threw towering, impenetrable columns of thick black smoke, pulverized rock, and burning debris hundreds of feet into the summer air. From their distant, supposedly safe observation posts along the surrounding ridges, high-ranking German officers watched the target area completely disappear beneath a boiling, chaotic, churning cloud of absolute destruction. Through their high-powered Zeiss stereo telescopes, telescopes, they saw the very topography of the Belbek Valley being violently, permanently rearranged in real time. The Earth itself seemed to be boiling up toward the sky. To anyone standing on those distant ridges, watching the relentless, earth-shattering impacts of the 2-ton shells, the conclusion was obvious, satisfying, and undeniable. Nothing built by human hands, no matter how much steel and concrete was used, could possibly survive such a concentrated, overwhelming application of sheer kinetic and explosive energy. They confidently expected that once the thick, choking veil of dust finally settled across the valley, they would see absolutely nothing but a shattered, smoking crater where the mighty Soviet turrets had once stood, the guns silenced permanently, the deeply buried subterranean bunkers crushed instantly into an unrecognizable, tightly packed tomb of twisted rebar, powdered cement, and shattered machinery. But the reality of the bombardment experienced a severe, fundamental distortion the exact moment it crossed the threshold of the Soviet defenses. Deep underground, beneath 13 feet of specialized naval-grade concrete, the defenders of Battery Number 30 were suddenly subjected to a physical and sensory nightmare unlike anything they had ever encountered in the history of warfare. The men manning the intricate plotting rooms, operating the heavy mechanical ammunition hoists, and maintaining the thrumming diesel generators were already hardened veterans of the brutal siege. They were intimately, painfully familiar with the concussive rhythm of standard field artillery, the screaming terror of dive bombers, and the constant, dull roar of the front lines. But this new sensation was fundamentally, terrifyingly different. This was not the sharp, percussive crack of high explosives detonating on the surface layer of the Earth. When the very first 2-ton shell from the Karl-Gerät slammed into the ground directly above them, it felt as though the entire planet had violently, abruptly shifted on its axis. The impact did not produce a loud, defined explosion inside the bunker. Rather, it generated a profound, bone-rattling seismic wave that surged violently through the solid rock, through the concrete foundations, and directly up through the soles of their boots. The immense, unimaginable kinetic energy of the projectile striking the Earth above transferred directly and efficiently into the rigid concrete structure of the fortress. The entire subterranean complex rang like a massive, deeply buried bell. The air pressure inside the sealed, claustrophobic corridors spiked violently and unpredictably, popping eardrums, causing intense physical pain and making it suddenly difficult to draw a full breath. Thick, suffocating layers of dust, accumulated over long months of continuous siege, were instantly shaken loose from the vaulted ceilings, plunging the dimly lit, narrow corridors into a choking, disorienting fog. In those first few terrifying, chaotic moments of the heavy bombardment, a profound wave of absolute dread washed over the Soviet crews. As the massive, earth-shattering impacts continued to strike with an agonizing, rhythmic, mechanical regularity, delivering one catastrophic blow approximately every 10 minutes, as the exhausted German crews frantically reloaded their behemoth outside, the defenders simply waited for the inevitable end. They listened in terrified silence to the heavy, muffled thud of the 2-ton shells physically striking the Earth above, followed a fraction of a second later by the deep, resonant, terrifying boom of the heavy delayed fuses finally detonating their payloads. They stared upward at the curved, heavily reinforced concrete ceilings, fully, rationally expecting the gray surface to suddenly spiderweb with deep cracks, buckle violently inward, and catastrophically collapse, burying the entire garrison under thousands of tons of crushing, inescapable debris. But as the heavy barrage dragged on, stretching from agonizing minutes into grueling hours, the initial paralyzing shock began to slowly, remarkably transmute into a surreal, grim realization. The ground continued to heave violently beneath their feet. The primary electrical lights flickered and died, forcing the crews to rely entirely on the dim, haunting glow of emergency battery lamps, and the air grew incredibly thick with the metallic taste of pulverized cement and diesel fumes. Yet the walls held. The heavy ceiling remained miraculously intact. The massive steel support girders groaned audibly under the shifting, incredible weight, screaming with mechanical stress, but they did not snap. The Soviet engineers who had stubbornly insisted on pouring 13 full feet of heavily reinforced concrete had given the trapped defenders an entirely impenetrable shield. The terrifying, unseen monster lurking somewhere beyond the ridges could shake their world to its very foundations. It could violently rearrange the entire landscape above them. It could plunge them into darkness and deafen them with endless seismic shockwaves. But it physically, mathematically, could not reach them. The profound realization rippled rapidly through the battery's exhausted crew, passing from the plotting rooms to the generator bays. They were actively surviving the absolute deadliest, most destructive weapon in the entire German arsenal. The simple, brutal mathematics of their poured fortress had successfully defeated the complex, highly engineered mathematics of the superweapon. This theoretical, unseen subterranean stalemate violently and dramatically transitioned into a very practical, highly visible surface reality on the morning of June 7, 1942. The German 11th Army had dedicated extensive, irreplaceable resources and an agonizing amount of logistical effort to carefully position their heavy siege mortars for what was definitively supposed to be the decisive, finishing blow of the campaign against the northern forts. For hours, the Karl-Gerät had systematically, methodically pounded the exact coordinates of Maxim Gorky I, dropping shell after shell into the target zone. The German artillery commanders, constantly consulting their meticulously plotted firing tables and checking their watches, were absolutely certain that the massive tonnage of high explosives and kinetic energy they had just dropped onto the target was more than mathematically sufficient to have completely cracked the main command bunker, severed the ammunition lines, and permanently disabled the heavy naval guns. The firing was temporarily, confidently halted to allow the dense, swirling curtain of dust, smoke, and pulverized earth to finally dissipate, giving the forward spotters a clear, unobstructed view to confirm the final kill. As the warm Crimean wind slowly dragged the thick clouds of debris away from the heavily battered, completely unrecognizable ridgeline, the German observers raised their heavy binoculars, fully expecting to see the twisted, smoking, completely silent remains of a vanquished fortress. Instead, they witnessed a sight that completely defied all of their careful calculations and, fundamentally, permanently shattered the deeply held illusion of their technological supremacy. Emerging slowly from the blasted, chaotic lunar landscape, entirely surrounded by massive, gaping craters that had completely swallowed the earth around them, the two massive armored turrets of Battery Number 30 remained fiercely, stubbornly intact. And they were not merely surviving as ruined monuments in the rubble. They were actively, aggressively operating. To the absolute horror of the watching German command, the heavy steel turrets began to slowly, deliberately rotate. The whining mechanical grind of the heavy Soviet hydraulic systems, miraculously undamaged beneath their 13-foot concrete shield, echoed loudly across the suddenly quiet valley. The four massive 305mm barrels elevated smoothly and purposefully into their firing positions, locking onto their targets. Inside the bunker, beneath the shattered earth, the Soviet crews, having endured the apocalyptic shaking and deafening noise, had seamlessly, professionally transitioned back to their battle stations. The heavy mechanical ammunition hoists, perfectly protected deep within the thick concrete shafts, efficiently fed fresh, heavy powder bags and massive high-explosive shells up into the breeches of the guns. With a sudden, deafening roar that rivaled the blasts they had just endured, Battery number 30 violently returned fire. Massive, brilliant tongues of flame erupted from the muzzles of the heavy naval guns as they hurled their own devastating payloads deep into the exposed German assembly areas, targeting the very infantry and artillery positions that had assumed the fortress was dead. The psychological impact on the German forces across the line was immediate, profound, and devastating. They had just confidently deployed the absolute pinnacle of their siege engineering. They had struck the target with bespoke weapons specifically and carefully designed to vaporize heavily armored fortifications. And the target had simply absorbed the apocalyptic blow, brushed off the thousands of tons of displaced dirt, and continued to fight with undiminished fury. For the Soviet defenders locked inside, the morning of June 7th proved definitively that they were not trapped in a concrete tomb. They were manning an impregnable, highly lethal bastion. They realized with grim satisfaction that as long as the thick concrete held, they could continue to rain utter devastation upon the attackers indefinitely. Despite this shocking, highly visible revelation of failure, the German High Command stubbornly refused to accept the mechanical reality of the situation on the ground. Driven by a rigid, unyielding adherence to their original tactical doctrine, and fundamentally unable to admit that their highly touted, incredibly expensive superweapon was entirely mismatched against the target, they doubled down on the failed bombardment. Throughout the remainder of June and stretching into early July, the grueling siege became a grinding, highly repetitive exercise in utter futility. The Karl-Gerät was strictly ordered to maintain its agonizingly slow, incredibly resource-intensive fire upon the Soviet position, regardless of the lack of results. Day after day, the heavily laden ammunition carriers crawled slowly across the deeply broken, dangerous terrain, dragging more of the 2-ton behemoths from the railheads to the exposed firing pits. In total, the German forces would expend roughly 200 of these gargantuan projectiles against the immediate vicinity of Battery number 30 and its surrounding interlocking defenses. This massive expenditure represented hundreds of tons of incredibly scarce, highly specialized munitions. It demanded thousands of man-hours of exhausting, dangerous labor from the elite artillery crews working under the constant threat of counter-battery fire. It burned through immense, irreplaceable reserves of precious aviation-grade fuel just to keep the massive machines operational, and severely wore down the highly stressed mechanical components of the mortar itself. The cumulative effect of this sustained bombardment on the surface landscape was absolute, undeniable devastation. The entire area surrounding the battery was violently transformed into a jagged, completely unrecognizable wasteland of deep, overlapping craters, utterly devoid of any remaining vegetation, roads, or natural geological features. The sheer kinetic energy repeatedly delivered to the site created a constant, inescapable atmosphere of psychological terror, forcing the trapped defenders to live for weeks in a perpetual state of violent vibration, choking dust, and deafening noise. The external, highly exposed sensory equipment of the fortress was entirely blown away. Critical surface communication lines were repeatedly severed, and the exposed, unarmored elements of the outer base were completely pulverized into gray powder. But the core, strategic objective, the actual destruction of the subterranean command bunkers, the crushing of the magazines, and the permanent silencing of the heavy guns remained entirely, frustratingly, unfulfilled. The specialized 2-ton shells, striking the broken earth repeatedly with the force of falling meteorites, continually failed to penetrate the 13-foot thick roofs of the main subterranean complexes. Occasionally, a lucky glancing strike or a massive splintering piece of heavy shrapnel would directly impact and damage one of the external gun barrels, temporarily reducing the battery's offensive output. But the fortress itself remained structurally sound, internally secure, and operationally lethal. The German command was aggressively bleeding critical wartime resources, heavily exposing their most valuable, secretive siege weapon to constant risk, and burning precious, irreplaceable time on the operational clock, all to achieve absolutely nothing more than violently rearranging the dirt on top of a concrete roof that stubbornly, mathematically refused to break. The mechanical Leviathan had finally slammed headfirst into the absolute, uncompromising limit of its capabilities. The pristine mathematics that had confidently promised a swift, crushing, effortless victory on the brightly lit drafting tables in Berlin had entirely, spectacularly disintegrated upon violent contact with the hardened, uncompromising reality of Soviet concrete. The German military apparatus had attempted to solve a deeply complex tactical puzzle simply by swinging an unimaginably heavier hammer, only to discover that the anvil they were striking was fundamentally unbreakable by kinetic force alone. If the heaviest, most destructive concrete-piercing shells in the entire German arsenal, delivered by the most powerful siege weapon on Earth, could not successfully crack the roof of the fortress, it became agonizingly, painfully clear to the commanders on the ground that artillery alone would never win the Siege of Sevastopol. The stalemate simply could not be broken from a safe distance. The comforting illusion of a clean, mechanized, highly engineered victory had vanished completely into the thick smoke, leaving behind a brutal, undeniable truth. If the superweapon could not silence the guns from afar, something far more basic and infinitely more costly in human lives would have to crawl through the jagged craters and physically break the fortress by hand. To dismiss the Karl-Gerät as a complete engineering failure would be a profound misunderstanding of its terrifying capabilities. The mechanical Leviathan was far from a useless weapon. When deployed against the targets it was actually suited for, its effects were nothing short of apocalyptic. 2 years later, during the brutal suppression of the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944, the German command would unleash this exact same siege mortar against the trapped Polish Home Army. In that urban environment, stripped of heavy naval concrete and deeply buried subterranean vaults, the true, unrestricted horror of the 600mm shell was finally realized. When those 2-ton projectiles plummeted into conventional city blocks, they did not just damage buildings, they instantly erased them. Entire apartment complexes were pulverized into fine dust in a single deafening roar. The weapon proved it could absolutely flatten city districts and completely demoralize defenders who had nothing but standard brick and mortar to shield them. In a conventional cityscape, it was the ultimate executioner. But on the jagged, sun-scorched ridges outside Sevastopol, a harsh and unyielding truth began to emerge through the dissipating smoke. The sheer, awe-inspiring spectacle of the massive weapon had created a dangerous optical illusion for the German High Command. The catastrophic blast, the towering columns of pulverized earth, and the seismic shockwaves disguised a severe gap between the raw destructiveness of a single hit and the actual practical military efficiency of the entire weapon system. Creating the largest crater on the battlefield simply did not matter if the objective inside the crater remained fully operational. The German military apparatus had fallen victim to its own obsession with scale. By hyper-focusing on the theoretical yield of the concrete-piercing shell, they had entirely blinded themselves to the staggering opportunity cost of fielding the weapon. The immense, irreplaceable resources permanently tied up in moving, hiding, and supplying this single mechanical beast were astronomical. The specialized railway cars, the converted tank chassis acting as ammunition carriers, the heavy lifting cranes, the thousands of gallons of aviation fuel, and the elite 21-man crews, all of this could have been distributed elsewhere. That exact same logistical footprint could have comfortably supported far more versatile, highly mobile, standard artillery batteries. A conventional artillery regiment could have rapidly shifted positions, adapted to the chaotic flow of the battlefield, and maintained a continuous, suffocating barrage across multiple sectors of the front. Instead, the German 11th Army had bottlenecked a massive portion of its logistical strength into a single, lumbering asset that could barely move 3 miles an hour and could only fire once every 10 minutes. They had built a terrifying weapon, a marvel of heavy industry, but they had fundamentally chosen the wrong tool for this specific, heavily armored job. They brought the world's heaviest sledgehammer to carefully pick a deeply buried lock. By the time the brutal summer heat of July set in, the Karl-Gerät had done everything it mathematically and physically could. The massive barrels were worn, the specialized ammunition reserves were severely depleted, and the landscape was permanently scarred. Yet, the guns of Battery Number 30 were still not silenced. The mechanical behemoth had violently exhausted its potential, leaving the final, desperate, and infinitely more brutal task to the men waiting in the trenches. With the massive guns of the Karl-Gerät finally falling silent, the terrifying burden of capturing Battery Number 30 shifted from the elite artillerymen in the rear to the dust-covered German infantry crouching in the forward trenches. They were the ones ordered to cross the shattered lunar landscape created by their own superweapons. As they climbed out of their staging areas in mid-June of 1942, the stark, brutal reality of the siege crystallized. The technological marvel had completely failed to provide a clean, mechanized victory. The capture of the most heavily fortified position in the world was going to be an intimate, grueling, and staggeringly bloody affair. Ironically, the very destruction wrought by the super-heavy mortars inadvertently shaped the grim infantry battle that followed. The massive, overlapping craters that had failed to crack the subterranean roof now provided perfectly contoured, heavily protected staging areas for the advancing German combat engineers. Moving under the suppressive fire of standard artillery and the screaming sirens of dive bombers, these specialized assault teams, the Pioneer, methodically bounded from one blasted depression to the next. They were armed not with 2-ton delayed fuse shells, but with canvas satchel charges, heavy flamethrowers, and wire cutters. The high-tech promise of an automated, mathematically perfect victory had abruptly devolved into the oldest and most vicious form of warfare: men crawling through the dirt to dismantle an enemy position by hand. By June 17th, the German infantry had successfully fought their way through the outer defensive rings and completely encircled the main fortress, severing the vital umbilical cords that kept the subterranean city alive. The towering Soviet naval guns above could hurl heavy explosives at distant assembly areas, but their massive barrels could not depress low enough to engage the soldiers swarming the blind spots right at the base of their own concrete housings. The defenders inside were mathematically protected from vertical strikes from the sky, but they were now entirely trapped within their own impenetrable shield. The combat engineers systematically hunted down the external ventilation shafts, periscope housings, and exhaust ports that the siege mortars had merely buried in loose debris. Once these critical arteries were identified and cleared, the engineers packed them with concentrated high explosives and poured raw gasoline down into the darkness. Below ground, the situation rapidly deteriorated into a suffocating, inescapable nightmare. The impenetrable 13-foot concrete roof, which had so effectively deflected the heaviest projectiles on Earth, now acted as a sealed, heavy lid on a boiling cauldron. With the primary ventilation system violently destroyed, the air inside the complex grew incredibly toxic, thick with the acrid smoke of internal fires and the accumulating, deadly fumes of the running diesel generators. The internal temperature spiked dramatically. Men who had bravely endured the deafening seismic shock waves of the heavy bombardment were now collapsing in the narrow corridors from sheer asphyxiation, severe dehydration, and heat exhaustion. The massive mechanical hoists slowly ground to a halt, not because they were shattered by a kinetic strike, but because the exhausted, oxygen-deprived men operating them simply lacked the physical strength to keep the heavy powder bags moving. The final silencing of the mighty Soviet guns came not in a blaze of high-altitude ballistics, but through the terrifying, claustrophobic reality of a close-quarters infantry breach. German assault teams brought up heavy demolition charges, placing them directly against the heavily armored steel doors of the subterranean entrances. When these outer blast doors were finally blown inward, it triggered bitter, desperate, corridor by corridor fighting in the pitch blackness of the complex. The surviving Soviet defenders, half-blind and choking on the thick smoke, fired back with small arms from behind pulverized rubble and ruined machinery. But they were entirely isolated, heavily outnumbered, and completely starved of basic resources. On June 26th, after days of agonizing point-blank combat in the dark, the organized resistance inside Maxim Gorky I finally collapsed. The giant turrets above ground fell completely silent, their breaches empty, neutralized only when enemy soldiers had physically closed the distance, climbed over the concrete walls, and wrenched the installation from the hands of the dying garrison. The staggering, unprecedented expenditure of the self-propelled mortar had merely rearranged the dirt. It was the relentless, grinding push of standard infantry units that actually broke the lock. The dust settled over the ruined fortress, leaving behind a profound lesson etched into the earth. Looking back at the massive, overlapping craters permanently carved into the Crimean soil, the deployment of the Karl-Gerät at Sevastopol stands today as a stark, undeniable cautionary tale of military engineering. When the German High Command approved the staggering resources required to build and transport one of the heaviest self-propelled mortars in human history, they were not just fielding a gun. They were attempting to purchase a devastating, effortless shortcut to victory. They believed that by simply scaling up the size of the weapon to unprecedented, apocalyptic proportions, they could entirely bypass the grueling, chaotic friction of traditional siege warfare. The sprawling craters they left behind certainly looked like a triumph of mechanical power, but they masked a profound strategic failure. The campaign against Battery Number 30 exposed the fatal flaw in this philosophy of sheer scale. The engineers in Berlin had successfully created a machine capable of delivering unimaginable kinetic energy, but they failed to account for the uncompromising reality of an active battlefield. They learned the hard way that raw, earth-shattering destructive power simply cannot compensate for extreme logistical vulnerability. A weapon system that requires a dedicated fleet of modified tanks, specialized railcars, and a constant, uninterrupted supply of aviation fuel just to fire a single round every 10 minutes is not a flexible tactical asset. It is a massive logistical liability, waiting to be paralyzed by a single broken supply line or a sudden shift in the front. More importantly, the grueling weeks spent bombarding the Soviet fortress revealed that a highly specialized weapon system is only as effective as its ability to adapt when its primary target stubbornly refuses to shatter. The Karl-Gerät was designed for a perfect mathematical scenario, relying on the assumption that its target would conform to pristine pre-war blueprints. When that theoretical math violently collided with the reality of heavily reinforced Soviet concrete, the superweapon had no alternative function. It could not increase its rate of fire to suppress enemy movements. It could not rapidly reposition to strike from a more vulnerable angle, and it could not maneuver to support the infantry in a dynamic, fluid assault. It could only sit in its meticulously prepared firing pit and continue to burn through irreplaceable resources, repeatedly delivering the exact same deafening blow against a structure that had already proven entirely immune to its specific design. The philosophical clash between absolute engineering hubris and the harsh, unyielding nature of combat had been decisively settled in the dust of the Belbek Valley. The German military apparatus had placed its absolute faith in a mechanical leviathan, assuming that the capacity to unleash the heaviest single strike on Earth automatically equated to tactical supremacy. But the ruined, silent concrete of the Soviet fortress, finally broken only by exhausted men crawling through the dirt with explosive satchel charges, proved that true military effectiveness cannot be measured by the sheer weight of a single projectile. Ultimately, it all comes down to what it actually means to dominate a battlefield. In the summer of 1942, the German military apparatus successfully deployed a mechanical leviathan that could undoubtedly dig the absolute biggest hole on any active front line. They engineered a monolithic 2-ton shell that effortlessly displaced thousands of tons of dirt, permanently rearranged the rugged topography of the Crimean Peninsula and unleashed a concussive shockwave completely unmatched by any standard weapon of its era. Yet, as the thick dust finally settled over the heavily pulverized ridges of Sevastopol, this relentless, highly resource-intensive bombardment left behind a harsh, uncompromising truth for the high command in Berlin. The grueling siege of Battery No. 30 ultimately proved that the capacity to make the largest crater does not automatically equal the capability to solve the largest military problem. When theoretical kinetic force violently collided with an immovable, heavily reinforced concrete shield, the most terrifying siege mortar in the world was effectively reduced to a spectacular distraction, entirely incapable of securing the effortless victory it had originally promised.